I like horror, I'm an artist. I think high art is a bunch of self-important hypocritical hagfish getting high off of their own slime. So today, let's talk about the 2019 high art culture horror film, Velvet Buzzsaw.
I can't save you.
Alright artists, you know the drill. Grab your sketchbooks, charge your tablet pens, make sure you've got some hydration juice nearby. Let's kick that inspiration block out the door and get you started on that project that you've been putting off. I promise to keep you company for an hour and a half, and hopefully today's topic will help spark that creativity. So hi-ho hello, what's the dealio? You know, horror doesn't cater to artists very often, so in some respects you might have to take whatever you can get. Velvet Buzzsaw is a satirical horror movie directed by Dan Gilroy that focuses itself around high art culture and the sort of people you might typically find in that environment, which means that our cast is composed of critics, art dealers, gallery curators, and even artists themselves. Some reviews might lead you astray in thinking that the artists within the film are in apparel comparable to that of the critics, but I'm going to tell you right now that that is not the case, and anyone who claims otherwise either wasn't paying attention or did not understand this movie. If you're an artist who actually respects the craft, you are, by default, safe from the looming force that exists as this movie's antagonist. As an artist, I have never felt less scared for my life than I did when watching this movie. Some may argue that there are two characters who serve as artists who were done in over the course of this film, but I'm gonna just flat out tell you that's wrong, because while one of them was an artist in the past, she flat out acknowledges within the narrative that she left that life behind her and would rather deal in the corporate end of things, while the other one isn't an artist and just desperately wants to be seen as one. Not a single practicing artist is harmed by the antagonistic force we're supposed to be afraid of. This leads us to what I believe to be a core issue with the movie's marketing and target audience. If this horror movie is going to predominantly appeal to artists, then it should be scary to artists. Yet, I don't believe that was ever the intention with this story. Sure, you could argue that general horror fans might get a kick out of it, but if they're not already versed in the high art marketing sphere, then they might miss out on a lot of the necessary nuance. If anything, they're just gonna view the cast we're forced to follow as snooty, pretentious jackasses, which, in fairness, is exactly what they are. The movie follows a cast of characters that work within the high art scene of Miami, Florida. Morf Vanderwalt, a critic whose word is so respected within the community that it could make or break an exhibition. Redora Hayes, a highly respected art dealer and owner of the Hayes Gallery, who herself has a past as an anarchic artist. Josephina, Redora's assistant, who I guess isn't a big enough name in the industry to get an established surname. Gretchen, a gallery manager who will turn private collection advisor. John Don Don, a competing gallery owner with a stupid name, seemingly a more recent player on the scene. Pierce, an older but now lacking artist who's struggling to rekindle his success after recovering from alcoholism. Damrish, an up-and-coming hot young artist whose work is highly sought after. Bryson, an installment technician who likes to prop himself up as an artist, but whose resume seems to only consist of him putting together pieces conceptualized by other people. And finally, Redora's new intern, Rococo.
It's Coco, actually.
Right, thank you. You could probably also make the case that Vetril is a character, but only in the past tense, as by the point we are introduced to him within the movie, he is dead. From the very beginning of the movie, as we are being introduced to the main cast of characters, we are also being introduced to an industry standard for hypocrisy and the seemingly necessary skill that is bullshitting. Morf, who is probably the closest thing we have to a main character, wanders into the film by bypassing a line of people waiting to enter a showing at Redora's gallery, demonstrating a routine level of entitlement and self-importance. This tells us a lot about Morf right off the bat. Firstly, we get the idea that he's been here before and done this 100 times over. Secondly, it showcases that Morf's a bit of a jerk. He's not willing to wait in line because he and his time are more important, which is actually understandable given that this is his job, whereas the people waiting in line are mere consumers. Point is, right from the get-go, we're hinted at the prospect of there being a difference between Morf and others, if not factually, then through Morf's own inflated perception of self. As he wanders the gallery floor, he examines various pieces with an unimpressed air about him. One piece, called Hobo Man in particular, he denotes as being uninspired because it's too similar to an installation he's seen in the past, which, given how often Morf must come to galleries to be allowed to cut the line and have tickets set aside, that's not really surprising. You'd think it would be obvious that at some point there's going to be some repetition or crossover. Since I imagine plenty of you watching are probably artists yourselves, you may question why that's relevant here, because obviously you can have the same subject matter and still have an artist's individual touch shine through. See, but that's because you're thinking like an artist. A plebeian, if you will. Morf thinks like a critic, and to Morf's critical mind, he's seen it before, and thus it's boring. Doesn't matter one bit if the artist was never aware of that other piece existing. His perception of this work of art is entirely based on his personal preferences as someone who has been spoiled by an abundance of artwork in his life. He peruses the floor like someone searching for a hot new commodity. Everything else too similar to what he's seen before, merely bleeding together into a mess that he can't even be bothered with, despite the fact that it's his job to bother with art. It is his job to engage with and understand the artist's perspectives, yet he clearly has no actual interest in doing that. In some respects, and with the correct lawyer-esque spin on it, that can serve as a selling point. You can't tell me that you can't picture a piece of contemporary art being lauded in the critical world for its bold choice to directly copy a famous Renaissance work as a means of conveying the limited finality of human creativity. Like, tell me with a straight face that this doesn't sound exactly like something an art critic would say. While Morf is detailing his lack of interest in Hobo Man, the dealer tries to offer a different perspective and is wholly ignored. He even starts asking Morf questions, and Morf literally just walks away while this man is trying to engage him. It's very obvious that once Morf has decided his opinion on a piece, nothing else matters. He's not the type of person willing to accept that his initial perception may be lacking. Also, he's rude. While some of this movie does cover the subjectivity and personal taste that goes into critics determining the value of art, I have to admit I would have liked there to be a little more focus on how that is conveyed from that critical standpoint. How does a critic manage to convince the public that a piece of art is worth millions? This aspect of the narrative feels very detached. We are told multiple times that Morf's word could destroy a gallery show if he finds it uninspired, but the effects of this are only ever conveyed to us through the gossipy whispering and blame games that the characters play with one another. We are told that Morf destroys these artists, but the effects of those actions are mere footnotes in broader conversations. In some respects, this works to demonstrate exactly how removed from the artist he is, but when this becomes a pivotal point in why Morf cannot be redeemed, it fails to hit the mark. If we are meant to get a sense that Morf has a habit of avoiding the consequences of his actions, then we, as an audience, require a visual scope of those actions. It's too easy to ignore the industry-led gossip of people that you dislike. Even here, Gretchen approaches Morf and asks for his opinion on a piece of artwork on display from the artist Pierce. Morf comments that sobriety has not done Pierce any favors, to which Gretchen points out that the piece they're looking at was actually created at the height of Pierce's alcoholism. Without skipping a beat, Morf comments, "Exactly," as if this had been what he intended all along. The way he then scurries away hints to us that Morf is insecurely hiding the fact that he failed to notice this. Despite his word being so respected and him using that to comment on the quality of Pierce's work, Morf wasn't able to differentiate between Pierce's work in the modern day versus that which was created at his most critically acclaimed point. One of the very people whose word would make or break a sale and thus directly affect Pierce's source of income has just demonstrated to us that he can't tell the difference between some of the artist's best work and some of his worst. Very early on, we see that this is nothing but a dog and pony show, and that the people with the most respected opinions on the matter don't actually know what they're talking about. His opportunistic and quick-footed nature then shines through as he hones in on another character crying, and he quickly runs off to pretend like he cares. I say pretend because while he walks over under the impetus that he will listen to her problems, he immediately starts grilling her for information on whether Pierce is switching galleries. He pivots the conversation from talking about her problems to his own curiosities, something that she wouldn't have any knowledge of based on her position. This is our introduction to Josephina, just after we've seen her taking a selfie outside of the gallery in front of an outdoor exhibit. Ah yes, this art is so beautiful, let me cram myself into frame in front of it. Don't worry, that nagging bad vibe with her will carry throughout the entire film. Actually, one compliment I can give to this film is the way it rounds out some aspects of these characters. Rest assured, they are basically all self-involved assholes, but small nuggets of information that were granted either shines a light on what sort of past experiences formed these cynical, opportunistic personalities, or actually make you feel bad for them in the sense that they have been victimized, if only for a short period of time. Josephina's introduction is paired with her learning that her boyfriend has been cheating on her, which would already make us feel a little empathy. But this is then compounded by the fact that she works in a demanding environment that doesn't allow her the opportunity to grieve in the moment. We feel bad for her because she's emotionally compromised, but she has to keep up appearances for work and so can't express it. Equally, while putting up the facade of friendship by feigning concern for her running makeup, Morf then tries to grill her for information. This empathy only lasts about 5 minutes, however, when she willingly serves as the other woman for someone else to cheat. This serves as an interesting contrast between Morf and Josephina specifically as the movie goes on. They almost act as narrative polar opposites, joined together by a tumultuous and ever-changing toxic relationship. While Morf is introduced as this pompous, self-involved destroyer of worlds, over the course of the film we see him break down out of fear and become more sympathetic. Whereas with Josephina, we're introduced to her as someone pitiable, who just needs the opportunity to succeed at her job. Yet once she's given that opportunity, she falls down a rabbit hole that progressively reveals a conniving, opportunistic side that perfectly fits in with the world that she's aligned herself with. As Morf feebly tries to better himself in an effort to save his own life, Josephina becomes more willing to use and throw away people who no longer serve their purpose for her. Here's where we meet Redora Hayes, standing like a proud mother showing off the adopted daughter she's prettied up in age-inappropriate ways for the Little Miss Whatever pageant.
I'm sick of white spaces.
That is so strange. I've been drawn to a bolder booth presence in terms of work and palette lately.
This adherence to showing in sterile monochrome cubes. It's just laziness.
This acknowledgement is hilariously followed up with a conversation over an installation called the Sphere, which is an almost entirely reflective surface and thus directly reflects the sterile monochrome environment that she's just detailed to us she finds to be so lazy. Rather than seeing beautiful pieces of artistic expression against the same environment, Redora and Morph's attention is drawn in by the one piece that creates the illusion of their own faces occupying that same space. Nothing about these lazy white spaces has changed, merely the subject being displayed upon them. Even before interacting with the Sphere, Morf calls it groundbreaking. This interaction alone, especially following Josephina's little selfie break, demonstrates to us how self-involved these characters are. They've grown tired of the default, but suddenly it's cast in a new light once their image is included as a part of it. They have no interest in the vulnerable emotional state conveyed through an artist's work, which you would think would be necessary for their job, and they instead hyper-focus on pieces that appeal to their inflated sense of self. Once they become a part of the art, all of a sudden it has value again. This is foreshadowing. Morf presses Redora about the same question, whether Pierce is moving to a different gallery. Redora deflects, retorting that she's represented Pierce for 17 years. When Morf points out that that isn't an answer, she does so again, this time by encouraging him to engage with the Sphere. Clearly, this group of people are very good at deflecting from their own failings and framing them as success. An after-party at Redora's bougie abode serves as our introductory setting to a slew of other characters, some more important than others: John Don Don, Pierce, and Damriche. The latter two serve as proverbial counters to one another. You've got the aged and experienced Pierce, who's already been through this rigmarole 100 times over and has become exceptionally bored with the shallow dealings of the art world, versus the up-and-coming Damriche, who's really only starting to cut his teeth on what this world offers. He's perceptive and knowledgeable enough about his craft to be able to veer the conversation into Redora's past as an artist, and while it's never outright specified within the movie, which I find to be a problem, she was actually a musician. part of a duo called Velvet Buzzsaw. Boom, movie title drop. Damriche is being brought in by Redora as a prospective replacement for Pierce. Redora likes to talk big about how she values loyalty, but we'll see throughout the film that this really only applies when other people are being loyal to her, as she rarely reciprocates that, and certainly not in any believably genuine way given her track record. During this party, Josephina is completely consumed by her own relationship issues, stating that this experience has made her never again want to date an artist. That won't last. Morf takes no time in physically indicating to us that he's willing to swoop in and scoop Josephina up, despite him literally just detailing to us that he's in a relationship that's apparently so deep that his boyfriend is considering marriage. Cool, so the guy with commitment issues is trying to make a move on the woman who just got cheated on. Sounds like a recipe for a great relationship. Josephina dips from the party early, heading to a satellite show outside of town, and Morf tags along. Not asking to tag along, just inviting himself to join her, kinda showcasing the entitled I do what I want mentality at play. By the end of the night, Morf and Josephina sleep together. Cool, so the woman who just got cheated on herself is fine with Morf cheating on his boyfriend with her. All of these people suck. In some respects, the setting and careers of the characters seemed superfluous. Like, the cast was very much akin to the types of morally objectionable, annoying characters that I would expect from your typical slasher movie, though with a few more points in their manipulation skill tree, and aged like fine wine. Whereas in other respects, it felt entirely on point, like the implications that while they thrive in respected critical positions, they can be just as ignorant in their own craft as the common layperson. The movie teeters along the edge of acknowledging that a career path that one would expect to be creatively liberating and expressive is, in truth, bogged down by these shallow, vapid opportunists. But I would argue that's kinda what you'd expect from art dealers and critics anyway. Money breeds the worst traits in people, that's kinda just how it goes. The characters that provide the products that everyone is marketing and profiting off of serve more so as footnotes. Piers only ever seems to take what is given to him, pushed around at the whim of those who print on the price tags, whereas Damriche, whose pending choice of whether or not to join Redora's gallery, serves as talking points for others, but he himself is only seen in small increments. Within the narrative, their personal feelings and autonomy as people are barely acknowledged by the rest of the cast. They are nothing but machines designed to churn out the perfect product, and when they can't do that, they're passed off to the next sucker just trying to get a slice of the pie. I straight up didn't know that Damriche was a popular commodity because of graffiti art until after finishing this movie. I don't ever remember Redora bringing it up, and I don't think at any point do we actually see any of Damriche's works. The movie could have said that Damriche was a singer, and it would have provided just as many visual indicators to show as much. Movies are supposed to be a primarily visual medium, meaning that you are supposed to be able to discern what's going on through what you see. There's a lot of information that this film makes absolutely no effort to convey to us visually, and it's not like they don't have the opportunity to do it. There's a scene later on where Morf is being psychologically tortured by art, where you could very easily insert a nightmare sequence where we see Morf's own visual interpretation of his bad actions. Even if we don't see them directly in the film, seeing Morf's visual of how they are tormenting him may be even more impactful. I would argue that this approach would be even more important in a film focusing around paintings and artists, because that is a wholly visual medium. Ironically, the artists are used as tools and a means to the end within this movie to about the same extent that they are exploited by the dealers and critics within the narrative. Characters that we're supposed to be excitedly anticipating the demise of because of that willingness to exploit creative minds. Actually, having spent a lot of time on DeviantArt growing up, you know what this feels like? Self-insert fanfiction. You know the kind, where the writer inserts some proxy character for themselves that is in no way flawed like the other characters, and where any flaws that do exist only serve to portray them as victims. It's mild, but that's what it evokes. So much of this feels like an artist's rebellion, and not in the good way. Like, I wasn't at all shocked by the caliber of people portrayed in this movie. I won't go so far as to say that it feels like it was written by someone who doesn't actually have a lot of experience in high art circles, circles, because it's not that, but I was sort of expecting a little more. I've been talking for a fair amount, and we've yet to even reach the point of introducing our proverbial antagonist, who may actually serve as something more like a savior depending on your personal opinion of high art circles and how little you actually like watching these characters. Some of this may come from the fact that I'm just good at talking your ear off, but it really does take a while for us to get to that point. That doesn't come from the actual runtime, it's just that the movie feels like it drags. Time goes by slower when you're forced to deal with people that you don't really like. Before heading to work the next day, Josephina stumbles across a neighbor she's never met, who himself stumbled so hard that he freaking died. Knowing that he also has a cat, she ventures into his apartment and comes across thousands of paintings that she immediately takes an interest in. It's told to us that the old man died whilst in the process of burning these works, and they have now been found by someone who sees value within them much grander in scale than simply kindling. The old man's name was Vetril, and despite the skill present in his work, nobody seems to have any insight into who he is. Dees is considered an outsider artist, a term referring to typically self-taught individuals with no formal training or contact with the conventions of the art world. While Josephina tries to keep her discovery under wraps so that she can be the one to unveil Dees's genius to the world, she's ratted out by Bryson, and Redora comes to collect, reminding Josephina that she's under contract and any discovery she makes while working for Redora also belongs to Redora. This is why you read the fine print, people. Also probably why you don't trust money-hungry culture vultures, especially given that they are already referring to the works of this unknown artist in a possessive sense. I'm not even sure if Redora knows at this point that this artist has passed on. She's just decided to take ownership here because she feels entitled to the discovery. Now a part of the Hayes Gallery exhibition, Redora's lawyers craft a new narrative regarding how Josephina found the art. Legally and morally speaking, they are going against Dees's final wishes by not destroying his paintings. Some people may view this moment where Josephina agrees to go along with this revised narrative as the point where she starts integrating herself with the toxic world that we've been viewing. Throughout this movie, we get multiple examples of Morf's hypocritical nature. Despite taking great offense to Gretchen implying that he and Redora have some sort of deal going where Morf specifically gives her good reviews, he does then make a deal with Redora where he creates the introductory for the exhibit in exchange for a few pieces for himself and exclusive book rights to Dees's life. This is basically cranked up to 11 when Josephina asks Morf to write a scathing review of her ex's art since he's having his own exhibition, and she wants to hurt him. Of course, driven by his little head and not the one attached to his neck, Morf agrees. This very quickly comes back to bite him, however, as during the Dees show, Morf comes to find out that not only do people wholly disagree with his critique of the show, Josephina's ex was so distraught over the review that he crashed his car in a drunken stupor and is now in a coma. This shows to us, within their community, Morf has the power to destroy people. Despite this, he's so careless with his own influence that he's willing to let the people he wants something from swing him around like a sword against others for their own personal benefit. This is specifically that tortured plot point that could have been visually expressed through a nightmare or a vivid hallucination for Morf. We never see it within the movie, but we could see Morf's guilt-riddled interpretation of it. Instead, we get one scene where Morf sees a painting reach out at him, and the audio-visual thing, I don't know, mocks him or something. It was kind of lame. During the show, which is, of course, a huge success, we find out that Redora has decided to hide away a large majority of the Dees paintings in order to create the illusion of scarcity to drive up their value. This behavior is something that was actually hinted at in that first gallery show we saw. Remember that older Pierce piece that was only seeing the light of day after he'd gone sober? Well, that was because Redora bought and then squirreled away some of his alcoholic pieces for a rainy day. That day apparently begins when he's struggling in the present and she has no incentive to buy his recent works. Yeah, remember how Redora was all about loyalty? This is finally where the horror of the movie starts. The halfway point. For the first half of the movie, we have just been watching a bunch of jackasses manipulate one another and prove themselves to be hypocrites in their own right. Sure, you can maybe argue that we've gotten a glimpse into the world of high art, but this is a Hollywood satire driven by a creative who really doesn't seem to like any of these people. While taking the paintings to be placed in storage, Bryson steals one for himself and becomes the first victim of what we shall refer to as the curse of Vetril Dees. When Bryson sees the ghost of Dees sitting in his back
seat, he crashes his truck into an abandoned gas station. Thoroughly burned, Bryson heads inside and over to a sink, trying to attend to his wounds. But hovering above the sink is a painting of monkeys working on a car. Much like the Dees painting from his truck, this one comes to life, and we cut away just as the monkeys reach out and try to pull Bryson into the painting. See, one of the issues with this movie is that it builds very slowly. We get our first kill at the halfway mark, the second a little bit past that point, maybe about 3/5 of the way in, the third kill about 3/4 through the movie, and then all of the final kills are more drawn out, clumped together, and relegated to the last 15 minutes of the film. It's almost like an exponential curve of horror, which in plenty of instances would probably be fine, but it really doesn't work here. Mainly because the characters that we're forced to follow are not characters that we enjoy watching. An exponential curve in horror works well when you are ramping up the tension with characters that you want to survive. It becomes progressively more nerve-wracking knowing that they could die at any moment and having those moments get closer and closer together. I would argue that the only characters you might want to survive by the end would be Morf, because while he is exceptionally flawed, he is at least reflecting on those flaws, if only out of self-preservation, and Coco, because Coco did nothing wrong. Velvet Buzzsaw's cast is composed of terrible people, to such an extent that this cast would be way more befitting of a very different type of horror movie. Slashers often have a similar character makeup in that most of the people we follow along with are either not morally respectable or else outright annoying characters to deal with for an extended period of time. However, slashers not only tend to have a cold opening to help us get an idea of the fate that we can expect for these characters, they also tend to spread the horror elements a little more evenly throughout the narrative leading up to the climax, or at least a good slasher will. In that regard, we often end up rooting for the slasher themselves because it's cathartic to see the main cast get taken out, sometimes in beautifully deserved ways. To top that off, they will usually have at least one character that we are hoping will survive by the end, typically the final girl. Velvet Buzzsaw doesn't have that. Aside from very sparse moments of regret and humanity within Morf, basically every single character is a greedy, self-involved, hypocritical asshole, and the extent of their time on screen is accompanied by a giddy anticipation within the audience over how karma is going to come back to bite them.
The only exception to this is, incidentally, the artists, who certainly have their own flaws, but not to the extent of the rest of the cast. Damriche is questionable in his willingness to go along with someone else's morally objectionable behavior, and you could argue in the eyes of Dees, his temptation to leave his roots for the sake of fame and fortune, whereas Piers has already obtained that fame and fortune and has found nothing of substance within it, whittling himself away at the bottom of a bottle for years and then having to struggle back to his own sense of self amidst an environment that encouraged that behavior from him in the first place. If anything, Piers was victimized by his own hubris and now has to pick himself back up, and the younger Damriche is being tempted into potentially the same fate. Their biggest flaw in this regard is the belief in what was sold to them, proverbially falling to the temptation. Redora herself even states that she doesn't sell material goods, merely a flimsy perception that can be popped like a bubble. For Piers, the bubble has already popped, and she's blowing a new one for a fresh victim.
Even the few meager efforts to better themselves don't seem to do enough to save these characters. Josephina 100% gets worse as the narrative goes on, taking far more influence from Redora, if not becoming worse herself, simply showcasing her true self more and more. Redora certainly doesn't grow as a person. I mean, hell, she indicates by the end of the movie that even if she'd known about Dees' final wishes, that wouldn't have stopped her from going against them. She's just honest enough to acknowledge that aspect about herself. The only changes she makes by the end are out of fear for her own life, purely for the sake of self-preservation.
The closest approximation we might have to a final girl is Coco, but I would argue that she showcases some of the same negative traits as the rest of the cast. It's simply to a much lesser extent, and so it's more difficult to see. One could very easily read her actions as naively benevolent to a degree, but I counter these with the broader context of these actions. Coco is the one to tell Josephina about her cheating ex, yes, and given that she claims to do this the morning after finding out, you could reasonably interpret this as a good-natured person trying to inform the victim as soon as possible. But she does this at the beginning of the day when Josefina is heading into work, and she does it over the phone, which is already a very impersonal means of delivering this news. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that telling someone they've been cheated on is going to be hard for them. So it was actually really inappropriate for Coco to pass this along to Josefina at a time when she wouldn't be allowed to express her grief. You also have Coco later jumping around as everyone's personal assistant, and the opportunistic means by which she secures those positions. She offers up her knowledge of potentially damaging information of Redora's business in order to get a job with Don Don, and she reveals world-shattering news to Morf, but only under the impetus that she desperately needs a job.
Equally, she doesn't have as big of a role in the movie, so our assumption about her better morals is essentially just coming from the fact that in not seeing her a lot, we're also not seeing her do terrible things like we are with everyone else. It's not that she does good things, it's just that everyone else does bad things.
The difference here is that Coco is victimized by proxy throughout the narrative, and so us feeling bad for her almost writes over these emotions. However, I'm not entirely convinced that Coco is as sweet and innocent as she seems. If anything, she might just be another Josefina, seemingly a kind person just down on her luck, but ready to bite when given the chance. It's entirely possible that this perception is bred from a cynical perspective the movie instills. We're just not given enough opportunity to judge for ourselves what Coco's true nature is.
Having gone through this movie a couple different times, Morf has this charm to him, but it's 100% just this facade that he's putting on. It all stems from this insecure air of intellect he has about him, but when you really look at it through a critical lens, it becomes apparent that his success as a critic potentially stems from the fact that he's just a jackass. Like, he cannot turn off the critical lens. At a funeral, he won't shut up about the presentation, the crowded seating, how gaudy he considers the coffin to be, and how horrible it would be to be buried in that for eternity. As if there isn't a time and a place. When Josefina comments that he needs to quiet down, Morf just denotes that he thought that she liked his intellect. Multiple times within the narrative, Morf is confronted with his own hypocrisy, almost always pertaining to his reviews having ruined the opportunities of the artist he talks about. Each time he either deflects or lashes out. At Don Don's funeral, Morf is confronted by the dealer for Hobo Man and told that his review killed the sale and relegated the piece to storage lockers. Morf very angrily asserts that he's not the dealer's mouthpiece, but he says this whilst sitting beside Josefina, the woman who asked him to write a review that would destroy her ex's show and to which he obliged. Josefina may be at fault for asking, and let's not discount how she immediately starts crying and playing victim when he infers that she has some responsibility in that regard. Lord in the depths, she's got her own manipulative baggage. But Morf was the one who purposely wrote a bad review of a show that he even admits he actually enjoyed, yet he continues to pass off the blame to others instead of acknowledging the part that he played in his own demise. It's not his fault for compromising his integrity as a critic, it's Josefina's fault for asking him to. So by the time he decides to cut and run, it's very clearly purely for the sake of self-preservation, and we don't feel bad for him when it proves to be too late. Morf hasn't actually learned why his behavior was deplorable. He doesn't feel guilty for cheating on his ex with Josefina. He doesn't feel remorse in knowing that his reviews could kill a person's career. He's just as willing to weaponize his word by the end of the movie when trying to get Redora to stop selling Deese's paintings. And it's equally for his own self-interest, passing blame onto Redora just as he's done for others throughout the movie. Then, of course, we have Redora, asseverating the importance of loyalty whilst churning out old pieces so that she doesn't have to support Pierce's new works, openly trading up for the new hot model and conspiring to insert spies into the lives of those she claims to be friends with so that she can get the inside scoop. The difference is that by the end of the film, he understands, thanks to Coco, that Redora had been manipulating him for the sake of getting good reviews for years, and so now he's given an opportunity to victimize himself at her hands rather than take responsibility for his own money-grubbing manipulative behavior. It's Redora's fault for selling the Deese paintings, not Morf's fault for taking an exclusive deal with her to delve into the private life of a dead man and taking some of the paintings for himself. Because that's the thing, if Morf were not himself responsible, he would not have been subjected to the curse of Vetril Deese. Vetril Deese, in life, was a man who had lost his mother and sister in his youth.
seemingly at the hands of his abusive father. After facing that abuse himself, he later turned on and killed that same abuser. Having experienced life in an orphanage, life at war, and life as an experimental subject within a mental institution, even in his older age, Vetril was a man to be feared. The backstory of his victimhood to experimentation may even serve as an explanation for why he's able to manifest his will through his paintings. Very lights out. I cite this specifically because while the other reason predominantly hinted at within the film may seem creepy, it's not actually unique here. Reflective of an artist's willingness to pour out their heart into their pieces, we find out that not only are a good number of his paintings references to his own life experiences, every single one of them uses Vetril own blood as a medium, mixed into the darker reddish tones of his shadows. A little on the nose there. There is blood lurking in the shadows of great art. See, fun fact, it's not actually terribly unique to include human tissue in art. In fact, plenty of famous paintings were painted with human remains, back when a pigment of brown was created by grinding up mummies. Yes, that was actually a thing. Incidentally, not the only thing that we used ground up mummies for, but that's another story. That's one reason I'm a little torn on this narrative and the writer's own experience with the high art scene. Because someone in this profession, who's probably gone over plenty of famous old paintings from time periods where poisonous and materials unconventional in the modern day were simply the standard, has likely seen this before in various ways. It's worth noting that not only do we have multiple examples in the modern day of artists putting their own blood into their pieces, such as Lil Nas X's Satan Shoes or the band Kiss mixing their blood into the ink used to print the first issue of their comic book, we also have example of artists using their blood directly as a medium, such as Lonnie Belosso's The Period piece or Mark Quinn's blood sculpture series Self. To top that off, I've done this too. A couple different times, actually. Like I said, it's not terribly unique. The framing of it as something out of the ordinary or horrific here appeals only to those who would not have knowledge of the broader art scene, which would not be the expected audience of this movie. The presence of blood within an art piece should not be as shocking as it's presented here. As a character, Deese is loosely based on Henry Darger, another self-taught outsider artist who became famous only after he died and who also spent time in an asylum. He spent years working on his body of work entirely in secret, and it was found plastered around his apartment only after his passing. Darger also had a mother and younger sister, both of whom he was separated from at a young age, though by different means than with Vetril Deese. If you're at all curious about Darger, there's a Down the Rabbit Hole video about him made by Frederick Knudsen. The name Vetril Deese came from an actual living person, though whose personality and life was probably nothing like the resulting character. Whilst perusing old census records from the 1800s, director Dan Gilroy came across the name and wrote it down as a possible character for his films, which, in fairness, I've done that too. One of the stories of Deese's life that Morf comes across is told to him by an ex-coworker. The implication was that you did not mess with Vetril Deese, because he would make you disappear. And what have all of these art snobs done if not mess with the wishes of a dead man? And you might even be thinking to yourself, but Bryson didn't directly mess with Deese. The paintings were already stolen, he just stole one again. See, that's where the second half of the Deese curse comes into play, and it's why I, as an artist, felt completely safe watching this film. The curse of Vetril Deese does not simply target people who steal from a dead man. What it actually does is go after those who denigrate art and treat it as a commodity. I'm sure you can understand why the art dealers and critics are in danger here. The stipulation of the curse, as I understand it, is that they have to have seen a Deese painting. This is specifically hinted to us in the opening animation of the film, that Deese's spirit resides within his paintings and stares back at you as you look inside, judging whether or not you are worthy and acting against those who are not. If you treat his art as a commodity and not a genuine and complicated expression of human emotion, then Deese's spirit would deliver deliver unto you an ironic death to serve as your punishment. Because he is an artist, of course he works in irony and symbolism. We can even see elements of this throughout the movie. When Redora first gets her hands on his artwork, for a moment we view the characters from the perspective of the paintings. We are literally seeing through Deece's own eyes. These eyes are then present in every instance where Deece delivers his punishment onto the cast. He is able to view them through other forms of art, and it is through these denigrated forms that he enacts his revenge. Earlier in the film, Bryson presented himself as an artist, but did so by denoting his involvement in putting together an installation that was conceptualized by someone else. He effectively took credit in the title of an artist and denigrated his true involvement as a manual laborer. Obviously, since Deece himself worked in manual labor, that wasn't the problem. It was that Bryson inflated his own ego by exaggerating his role to make himself seem more important in the art world. His sin was that of pride, a commonality with all of Deece's victims. So when the curse came after him, it trapped him within a forever hell of the very job he tried to escape through his boasting. You could also make the case that Bryson was the only reason Redora found out about the Deece paintings. If he hadn't told her about Josephina's discovery, then the paintings never would have wound up in the Hayes Gallery. Twofold, Bryson made it possible for Deece's work to be exploited on a larger scale, and he sought to market himself as an artist to avoid the manual labor jobs that otherwise supported his craft. In truth, I don't think the action of stealing from a dead man mattered here. If Josephina had seen and appreciated Deece's works for what they were, as artistic expressions, then I feel like she would have been safe. If she had kept the paintings for herself, she would have been fine. The danger of the curse only comes through an exploitation of artists and their craft. If instead you show admiration or take inspiration from the works, you are safe. This is why the two other practicing artists in the film are unaffected, and I would actually argue that there's a benevolent side to Deece's curse that benefits those who are deserving. Rather than profiting off of Deece's work, both Piers and Damriche use it to inspire themselves artistically. Damriche uses it as an inspirational incentive to reject Redora's deal and return to his original art collective, favoring genuine artistic expression and a love for the craft over the fame and glory offered to him. In a similar fashion, after finding himself questioning his own artistic integrity upon seeing these groundbreaking works from an unknown genius, Piers uses the inspiration offered to him as a means of reconnecting himself simply with the joy of creating something beautiful, foregoing his fancy studio and the worldly possessions he'd accumulated and taking on the appearance of a poor man creating art, not for it to last or be sold or seen, just for it to be made. Even though both of these men were looking down on art, it was their own art, and it was from a place of self-consciousness and longing to attain peace through their creations. They didn't want to profit from the work and then shove it to the side to be forgotten. They wanted to be better. Symbolically speaking, Deece's spirit lives on through the artists that he inspires. For while he may have been a flawed, damaged, and dangerous man on his own, he could still touch people's hearts through an emotional expression of his own traumas, fears, and hopes. Through his art, he was able to create and pass on something good. The curse of Vetril Deece is the rage of an exploited artist manifest. It punishes those who seek to further that exploitation and rewards those who take inspiration from it, even if it was as a result of being exposed to it through that exploitation. It holds no ill will for passive viewers, only the greedy and hungry wolves that seek to devour, spit out, and move on to another victim. This comes together by the end of the film when a stolen crate of Deece originals is hung out by an unhoused man for sale. Unsuspecting patrons pass by and are just as encapsulated by Deece's work as the critics throughout the film. By this point, the movie is basically telling you, you'd better appreciate art as an expression and not a commodity, because you don't know if the curse of an artist will come to visit you. I've seen a few reviews of this film that misunderstand this final scene, detailing very matter-of-factly that those buying the Deece pieces would either be entirely unaffected by the curse, or alternatively, every single one of them would become a victim of it. In the former presumption, detailing that so long as these patrons were unaware of who created the works and just appreciated them for what they were, they would be safe. This is not true! Throughout the film, we are shown examples of people who are killed not because they looked down on Deese's work, but because they exploited Deese's work, thus activating the curse, and were then killed by a form of art that they did look down upon. Because Deese's curse is not selfish, it doesn't discriminate. Deese recognizes the importance of various forms of artistic expression, and he punishes those who denigrate art, even if it's only a small sample size. They were killed by pieces or forms of media that they showed disdain for. Josefina and Rodora specifically are made to be a part of the art that kills them, reflecting their self-involved arrogance. In the end, the two of them got their wish. Does sort of make you wonder if the only reason Josefina was dating artists was because she wanted to serve as their muse. Paint me like one of your art critics. Actually, to veer into Josefina for a moment, she's an interesting character. At the beginning of the movie, the way Morf is hovering around her and trying to make a move on her whilst she's in a compromised emotional state, you get this sense that he's taking advantage of her. But as the film progresses, you find that Josefina is just as cutthroat as the rest of them. I think I noticed this especially when she first met Damriche, because she claimed at the moment that she was a huge fan of his work. But, unless I'm totally reading this wrong, Damriche works in graffiti art, which Josefina looks down upon, which would mean that she lied to him about liking his art so that she could get something out of him. It's not until he tells her when he's leaving Rodora's gallery does she hint at how little she thinks of the type of art he creates. She basically insulted his medium to try to get him to do what she wanted. Not to mention the fact that she knew Deese wanted all of his art destroyed. It wasn't simply a matter of plausible deniability where she could have told herself that he just happened to be burning the pieces that he didn't like. She was flat out told that these were his wishes upon his death. She chose to withhold that knowledge. It's easy to see Josefina as a victim who was just trying to claw her way through the ranks before you truly recognize how conniving she is. Realistically, that's probably her biggest asset, that as some pretty high-class girl, she can come across as harmless. Back on topic. Arguably, the only person killed by a Deese painting is John Dondon, who is pulled into what we can assume is a recreation of Deese's childhood home through a different art exhibit. You could also argue that Dondon was a unique case, in that his exploitation stemmed predominantly from arrogant ignorance. There's a scene after he's recruited Pierce to his gallery where he goes to see what Pierce has created, and takes a moment to appreciate a literal pile of trash bags, incorrectly assuming that this is the new piece that Pierce is presenting. He's so full of himself, so lost in the sauce of profit, that he can literally ascribe artistic intent to garbage. See what I meant when I said earlier that art critics have a lawyer-esque ability to spin basically anything into an artistic masterpiece? This is probably why he's killed within the attic installation, because an individual's attic to others just seems like a collection of useless junk. Much like Bryson being pulled into the forever hell of perpetual maintenance, Dondon's death in the attic symbolically hints that he himself is trash that is best hidden away and forgotten. He may have been killed within the original attic installation, but he was pulled into a Deese painting for a moment. As you can tell, the attic Deese's curse creates is notably different from the one portrayed in the installation. Similarly, Rodora's death is prophesized by the Deese painting she owned in her house. She's not directly killed within it, but it marks the point where Deese finally comes to claim her, as she incorrectly assumed that she had removed all traces of art from her life. In the moment that she felt safe, she herself recreated the painting without even realizing it, symbolically alluding to the subtlety of the natural and coincidental art that exists all around us. Something that you may notice is that almost all of the characters are pulled into and essentially become a part of the art that kills them. The attic installation, sphere, graffiti, the prophetic painting, the monkeys. Arguably, the only instance where this doesn't happen is with Morf, the critic. As if, even when judged by Deese, he was not worthy of becoming a part of the art that he'd spent a good chunk of his life trying to destroy. It's almost like that extra little slap to the face, and it's not like Dees wasn't already taking his time and playing with his food. Dees taking a hold of Morf only after he's proverbially doused himself in gasoline and lit a match is like mocking him from beyond the grave. Morf has given up everything, compromised his own morals, not only for the sake of profit and sex, but also in a desperate plea for his own life. Yet still, it wasn't good enough. Dees forced him to showcase to the world exactly how much of a hack he truly was. This is actually the only thing I can presume to be the reason Morf lasts so long. Don Don died before him because he was already widely accepted within the community as a shallow hack. Morf had to ruin his own reputation because even when he wrote reviews that people disagreed with, they still held far too much sway within the community. Initially, I did question why Don Don went before Morf, because my perception was that if Dees didn't want his paintings broadcast to the world, it made no sense to go after the man who was going to expose Dees's life in an effort to ruin Redora's sales. Don Don's actions would have stopped the exploitation of Dees's work, whereas Morf's actions played further into it. But with a final watch, I think I've come to understand why. Not only could you make the argument that exposing Dees's life is still exploitation to a degree, simply with a different flavor, I think it's very apparent that Dees didn't want his life exposed. He was extremely reclusive, and while all of his artwork depicted scenes from his life, he opted to have them destroyed. He didn't want these personal depictions of his own trauma to be gawked at. Don Don choosing to try and expose Dees's personal life the very next day basically bumped up his own expiration date. Morf, on the other hand, was already proven to be someone who could be manipulated, and I think this was probably what Dees was counting on, that if he scared this man who had such sway within the community, he could use him to stop that exploitation. Morf's fate was sealed within his very last decision regarding this art. See, at different points in the film, the characters draw attention to how horrible it is to lock art away. Gretchen acknowledges that the rich hoard it, the analyst mulls over a painting that's been locked up since the 90s and is destined to return to storage, and Josephina directly asks the question,
Jesus, what's the point of art if nobody sees it?
knowing that Dees wanted his works destroyed, knowing that his own life was in danger, Morf still could not bring himself to respect this artist enough to abide by his final wishes. Rather than destroy the paintings he owned, he tried to put them in storage. I think this was the final nail in the coffin. Dees had given him every opportunity, and at the last minute, he cocked it all up. Despite the fact that these dealers and critics only have their jobs because of the work put out by artists, I would almost guess that there's a level of disdain directed at them for it. Like they're so infuriated by the notion that they can't create pieces that bring in millions of dollars on their own, so they piggyback off the waves created, and this manifests as a jealousy towards those who carry it. They have absolutely no incentive to take care of those same artists that they profit off of, because they know they'll simply be able to move on to something else at the drop of a hat. The audience will move on, and there will always be a new hot commodity. We can see this through everyone proclaiming that Pierce was better as an artist when he was an alcoholic, giving no career incentive for him to maintain his sobriety. Despite the fact that Pierce can make a profit off of recreations of his past successes, he derives no pleasure from it, and his new pieces don't sell. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about how he, as an artist, gets no emotional benefit from commodifying his own work. Or through Morf saying that his review destroying Josephina's ex's installment saved him from irrelevance, even though he damn near tried to end himself as a result of it. That somehow being relevant is more important than being healthy or alive. Hilariously, in hindsight, the downfall of an acclaimed critic's reviews promptly followed by their untimely death probably made Morf a pretty relevant talking point within the community, something to gossip over at the next gallery event. content. Except now that he's on the receiving end of that perspective, I have a sneaking suspicion that he wouldn't agree with it anymore. You'd think that Redora would be more sympathetic to artists as a result of her artistic background, but no, she hides it, she ignores it, and she incentivizes herself through profit. If an artist can't make her money, then their usefulness has dried up in her eyes. In that regard, conceptually, it makes sense for the narrative to hyper-focus so much on the works of this artist who passed, because in the minds of those two-faced, self-involved hypocrites, that's probably the best outcome for them. Redora details that scarcity leads to profit, and so knowing that no other pieces will be created means that you can charge more for the existing ones. It's why she had to fake scarcity to try and milk Dees for all he was worth. If Pierce had passed as a result of his alcoholism, profits would have skyrocketed. Realistically, he does a disservice to Redora's business by bettering himself, which is why she had no qualms about losing him as a client to John Don Don. He was no longer the struggling, tortured soul that she bought him as. I didn't mention this earlier, but in that first gallery scene, Morf asks if Pierce is dating someone named Dorothy. While we never meet a character like this within the narrative, this might be indicative that Pierce is getting to the point where he can maintain healthy relationships for prolonged periods of time. The dealer's model for profits is built off of suffering and control over others. If the subject isn't suffering, if the dealer can't control the narrative, then they're a money sink. For a gallery owner, the perfect artist is a troubled, genius, unknown, dead one with no living family members. Because a dead artist cannot advocate for their rights or their artistic integrity. A dead artist cannot choose to reject your offers. They don't need to be paid, they can't say things that reflect badly on the gallery or ruin their reputation, they can't be scooped up by better deals. That's why having that narrative flipped on them by the curse of Vetril Dees is potentially so cathartic. Here the lot of them thought that they'd found the goose who laid the golden eggs, only for those eggs to break open and unleash a swarm of venomous spiders. In the end, their greed and resulting lack of empathy was their downfall. I definitely haven't been talking about her enough, but Gretchen is not immune to this power play. She's just also collectively in the movie for like a maximum of 4 scenes. Okay, no, that's not fair. It's probably a few more than that, but she just doesn't have as much of an impact. See, Gretchen previously worked as a gallery manager, but made the switch to private collection advisor because she wanted to control the narrative of the artistic world. She became dissatisfied that the public so infrequently gets to view the truly beautiful pieces at play, the wealthy hoarding it all for themselves. So she opted to become a part of that very system that she hated for her own selfish benefit. She ends up working for the same collector who bought the sphere, and when approaching Redora to try to purchase some original Dees paintings, Redora proposes the deal that she gets her buyer to take on 3 Damriche pieces in his upcoming exhibition in exchange. Upon questioning what she's supposed to do if her buyer doesn't bite, Redora tells her, "You're the advisor, advise." Maybe it's just me, but that line effectively screams to me, this is the fault of the profession that you've chosen. The problem is that the wealthy hoard art, but also they hoard art based on what their advisors tell them. Sounds like the art they hoard is predicated on the professional opinions of the very career Gretchen has jumped into. This woman really said, I hate this thing, but let me just get a bite of that pie. Talk about becoming a part of the problem. That actually makes me question whether Gretchen would have been subjected to the curse had she not recently changed jobs. Because yes, she mocked the concept behind the sphere, but that was a piece that her client had bought. That was a piece that she potentially advised her client to buy. If she herself thought the concept behind the piece was laughable, then she only advised them to buy it as an investment, as a commodity. If she had remained a gallery manager and been forced to exhibit the sphere even though she didn't favor the installation, it may have been fine if there was a demand for the public to see the piece. Even more so, then she would have not been limiting the public to only pieces that she liked. After all, not every art piece is going to speak to everybody. We can't all be as vain as Morf and Redora. Although, it's 100% worth noting that right before Gretchen was killed, she threatened to go above the heads of the gallery managers at her last
half-ass job so that she could reduce the emerging artist exhibit in favor of showcasing more from her client's collection. Deese's issue could have specifically come from her selfish desire to prevent other artists from having their work seen. The movie gives us no indication that the curse goes after people indiscriminately should they not appreciate a single art piece. That would actually make it terrifying because nobody likes every single art piece in the world. Every individual has pieces that speak to them on a personal level, but not every piece out there can do that. Preferences are a thing. The curse requires the commodification and then denigration of art. It requires the exploitation of artists. It acts upon their blood, sometimes figurative, as with Morf ruining the sale for Hobo Man, and sometimes literal, as with Morf ruining Josephina's ex. A big question that I had while watching this movie was, why are the kills happening in this order? In terms of story progression, I understand it to a degree. They need to happen in this order so that the movie doesn't lose out on the most pivotal members of the cast, and so the audience can slowly pick up on how the antagonist force works. But narratively, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Remember, the first person we see affected by the curse is Bryson. But why him? Bryson stole a couple paintings for himself, but this was after Josephina stole over 1,000 paintings for the sake of exploiting the work of a dead man. Bryson being the first to die seems shallow, which I'm not entirely sure was the point given that it was his own shallow pride that did him in. Yes, he wanted to prop himself up as an artist. Yes, he was partially taking credit for the artistic endeavors of others. Yet I interpreted this as someone who fails in his own creative outlets, aspiring to get to that point. Just as with Coco, I feel as though we didn't get enough of Bryson to justify why he went so early. You know, in a sense, considering it was still halfway through the movie. Was it a prideful laziness where he couldn't even be bothered to attempt to succeed creatively? Or was he an artist behind the scenes, simply not a successful one? Was his taking of credit a childish means of inserting himself into a world that he dreamed to be a part of? In some respects, that may be the point of Deese. He was a very troubled man, and so any judgment passed by him onto others could be heavily colored by his own trauma and mental health issues. But then I question who we're supposed to feel sorry for. Do we feel bad for Deese as a result of his imprisoned exploitation? Or do we feel bad for his victims, who are, in essence, being unfairly attacked for morally subjective behavior? You mean to tell me Bryson, the guy whose only notable crime in this movie was tattling on Josephina, was worse than Morf, the guy who compromised his morals as a critic to pan an exhibit he actually liked at the behest of his new girl toy so hard that it drove the artist off a cliff? I'm expected to believe that Bryson is worse than that. So why was he the first person killed? Well, because he's the least developed character. He was designed to be an easy first kill. However, if moral ambiguity was meant to be a point of interest here, then why were the only two examples of practicing artists so pitiable? Piers was cynical and jaded, yes, but he'd been beat down by the system and his struggles with substance abuse for years. Damriche may have continued his fling with Josephina, but he was actively being preyed upon throughout the narrative. If anything, for him, falling for Josephina was kind of the point. He was being tempted by a manipulative seductress. When compared to the rest of the cast, the artists are nothing but victimized money factories. If Bryson himself wasn't an artist, then why didn't we get an example of an artist who does actively commodify their own work and only creates for the sake of profit? That would have then presented the question of what are the correct reasons for creating art? Are there correct reasons? Or is Vetril Deese just as hypocritical and prideful as those he passes judgment upon? Did he think himself better because he hid his art away? The irony of this being a satirical horror is that the critics themselves are being criticized here, but in a lot of ways you can read that, in and of itself,
himself as being just as hypocritical as these critics and dealers are being portrayed. To critique is their job, and while one might not agree with their decisions or assessments, it cannot be denied that this is a niche of human intrigue that people within this camp have simply capitalized on. You can argue that a job offers no real value or substance all you want, even more hilarious in this instance given that artists hear that all the damn time, but if people are willing to pay them for it, that still counts as a job, and it means that people do find value within it. Like, do you think Morf's money appears out of thin air? No, he's capitalized on his ability to market his personal tastes. To criticize them for doing their job, that being to express to the public what art they view to be worth more or less, is tone deaf when you realize that artists are equally expressing to the world that which they personally believe to have value. I draw an abundance of cephalopods because they're my favorite animal. I aspire to write comics because I value them as a storytelling medium. Of course, one can make the case that an artist's work is more personal, but as we saw from Morf, it's possible for the critics to take personal offense when the value they perceive to be offering is rejected. In many respects, you could view people expressing themselves artistically as being just as self-involved a mentality as that which these critics are being punished for. Dees, for example, almost completely socially isolated himself, meaning everything that he painted was based on personal experience. He didn't bother with the lives of other people, merely his own. Within this isolationist and socially violent mentality, he was self-involved. Sure, it was partially the result of trauma and mental health issues, but you could argue that Redora was in a similar boat, and that the business persona she'd crafted was a means of protecting herself after a traumatic loss and already experiencing the other side of the art world. Dees didn't want people to acknowledge his work, therefore the value only came in what it offered to him? Okay, well, neither did Redora. She shrugged off her prior contributions to the art world because they brought up bad memories. I would argue that this could apply even more in a high art setting because in that sort of environment, I would think it would be more likely that respectable artists could turn to catering to the whims of the masses, bullshitting a controversial or thought-provoking meaning behind a piece of work that they themselves didn't actually care about because doing so would make them more money. It's for this reason I question why we didn't get a character like this within the film. So in trying to demonstrate how hypocritical and deserving of punishment for their selfish nature these critics are, the creators of the film ironically put themselves in a similar boat. Seriously, you can't tell me it's not hilarious that creatives, who were probably told throughout their lives that what they were doing wasn't a real job until it garnered them success, made a film pointing out the lack of value offered by critics and dealers. Artists can be awful people too. How convenient that all of them were worthy of redemption and inspiration while the critics were not. Upon additional watches, Don Don's placement makes sense. Same with Morf. I understand that Morf had to have his word destroyed before his body could follow suit, and obviously that took time. After Don Don came Gretchen, which is maybe one of the more understandable placements here. Following the more nebulous and up to interpretation deaths that were Bryson and Don Don, Gretchen's death confirms to us a lot of the factors necessary for the curse to work, where once we may have only been speculating, now it's spelled out to us in bloody red ink. Josephina and Redora lasting as long as they did doesn't make sense to me outside of the fact that these are main characters and thus they go last. Remember earlier when I mentioned that some reviews misunderstood the final sale of Dees's art on the street, interpreting this as meaning that the curse was now loose on all of those who bought his works? I would argue that there's literally proof in the movie that this is not the case. That the curse doesn't just affect anyone who views or owns one of these paintings. For one thing, when Josephina steals the paintings from Dees's apartment, she hasn't sold them yet. And she's fine. For another, there's the hundreds of people who attended the initial Dees exhibition, no sign in the story of any of them being affected. Then there are the clients who bought the paintings, one of whom Gretchen works for. We never see any of these people, and Gretchen is the only one from that camp who faces punishment. The analyst, despite taking apart pieces of Dees's work to understand their compositions, thus learning about and exposing the blood tissue within them, is also completely unaffected. Like I said, the curse punishes those who profit and exploit art, not those who simply appreciate or purchase it. This movie was made to make critics and artistic opportunists feel unsafe. It was made to make artists feel vindicated. Unfortunately, as a horror movie that artists are more likely to gravitate towards, that is one of its biggest failings, because it's still a horror movie. By default, I feel as though the very nature of critiquing art critics in an artistic format, you're probably just going to get them scoffing at you. It also fails in many respects within the visual format. Objectively, there are parts of this movie that make absolutely no effort to convey information to the audience visually. We're told about all of the different ways that Morf's reviews have harmed people, but we never see it. This same problem actually comes in Deese's haunting of Morf. The first time we see Deese's work come to life to frighten Morf, he confesses that he's been seeing things. So this has been happening to the character for a period of time already, and we just skipped over all of that. Like, the movie didn't feel as though it were important for us to see Morf being haunted. We're simply told that this isn't the first time. I think the big issue with this level of detachment may be because these are some of the core reasons why Morf cannot be redeemed as a character. It's why the curse takes him. When we aren't privy to that information, the justification behind Morf's fate doesn't hit as hard. In a similar vein, the art in this movie feels too much like background decor, and not a pivotal part of everyone's careers. Even Deese's paintings, for as important as they are, and for as many as there are supposed to be, it feels like we only get to see a couple, and very sparsely. If you go into this movie looking for art, then you might come out of it a little disappointed. It's there, but somehow still lacking, and I can't quite place why that is. Something else I found myself questioning, especially with the reveal from Coco about Redora's spy, was why this never came up as a conversation point between her and Josefina. When Josefina disrupts this plan, you would think that Redora would confront her about it, but she never does. Josefina basically ruined a good thing that Redora had going for her, and it was never brought up. You'd think that would come back in excess when she starts dating Damrish. Like, Josefina's love life is specifically wreaking havoc on Redora's business, and she's never confronted about it. Gretchen, being her typical busybody bitch self and tearing Morf and Josefina apart through her gossip, could have either been passed onto Redora instead, or it could have been a favor that Redora asked of her. Seriously, Redora seems too calculated to just let this go along without saying anything about it. Morf's exploitation had a past to it that had to be dismantled, so for as long as Deese was infecting his mind, his reviews would progressively get worse. Josefina, on the other hand, gets worse as the narrative goes on. You could perhaps make the case that Deese had to see her try to exploit an artist other than himself, and that didn't come to a head until Damrish defied her. There may also be something to be said about how truly down on her luck she is at the beginning of the film, and how much of that was actually her fault. The morning she finds Deese, she's wearing one outfit, but by the time she gets to work, chastised for being late by Redora, she's wearing something completely different. Outside of the possibility that this was just a costuming issue, within the narrative, this means that Josefina went home and changed, and was late to work as a result of it. Yet when she got to work, she blamed that lateness on finding Deese's body. So she's lying. She even tried to discredit Bryson as the person who informed Redora about this by painting him as a creeper trying to make her look bad for rejecting his advances. But Bryson didn't cause her to be late, merely kept track of it for their boss. That removes any possibility that her ragging on her ex's art for being uninspired and derivative is the result of her being hurt by his actions, because now we can see that she just has a habit of doing this.
I swear to God, I want to hurt him.
She paints others in a bad light to serve her own needs. Just very small nuggets like that showing you a little more behind her as a character. Redora is a hard one. She's very clearly been in the art scene for decades. Objectively, she is the big bad wolf on the prowl. But not only are there soft, squishy parts hidden behind her hard exterior, she has her past as an artist and her resulting trauma, establishing her as a past victim that has since turned abuser. It's obvious that she was never going to be allowed to live, because even in ridding herself of art, she likely had no intention of dismantling her business. For that reason, I question why she lasted so long. She had done too much damage to be given a pass, so what was the point in letting her live for so long? What purpose did it serve? A lot of people seem to find this movie lacking, and I can't really blame them. They don't like it and they don't find it scary, and I think this is for two reasons. One, the characters we're forced to follow are exceptionally unlikable. As I mentioned earlier, slashers often have this same makeup, but the point of slashers is typically to watch the characters die and get their comeuppance in gloriously gory ways. Velvet Buzzsaw takes too long acting as a satirical drama. The first death that we get at the halfway mark almost acts like a cold open, because we never see the end result of how Bryson dies, and at that point some people have probably already checked out. Two, once you understand how the curse works, it's no longer scary. It would only be scary to those who actively seek to exploit art and then show a disdain for it either after or while doing so. So maybe movie critics might find it scary if they didn't interpret the whole film as a transparent means of making them feel guilty for not liking a piece of media that subtly mocks and denigrates their profession as critics, which, let's be real, they're critics, they probably would. May as well be a 2-hour version of the movie critic from The Lady in Water getting eaten. Like, the fear of a curse-driven movie stems from the idea that the curse could affect you. That's why media like The Grudge is so terrifying, because you could be subjected to a curse by simply walking into the wrong environment or picking up the wrong cursed object. The Curse of Vetril specifically requires a willingness to exploit the hard work of artists or the disdain for the artistic practice or a specific medium, which may not necessarily be something that the wider audience can relate to. And that's assuming they understand how it works, because, like I said, the various reviews of this movie that seem to misinterpret this curse showcases that it wasn't well defined within the film itself. The other part of this fear stems from us rooting for the characters that we want to survive, which Velvet Buzzsaw doesn't provide because all of the characters are awful people. Except maybe Coco, but she's barely a factor. Realistically, unless you're an art dealer, a critic, or a pretentious artist, or maybe like, I don't know, an AI bro or something, the curse isn't actually that scary. Maybe that's just me. Actually, that would make for an interesting sequel. The Curse of Vetril going after AI bros. Maybe they've managed to track down a number of the original Lost Dees paintings. Some guy's trained an AI model off of them and is now creating forgeries, and something about the process creates a new curse that wreaks havoc to make a comment on artistic plagiarism. Truthfully, in terms of the deaths, I was a little underwhelmed. Morf's death was fine. I get the symbolism of it, and you could definitely interpret the position he's killed in as being representative of how he screws people over. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But it just feels like it's not terribly well done. Josefina and Redora definitely have the most artistic deaths. These are the types of deaths that I would have expected from this movie, which is why it's so disappointing that you have to wait until the very last minutes to get what you're looking for, and it only comes from 2 of them. Gretchen's death is very modern art, very contemporary performative. It almost feels like a combination of exercises by Marina Abramovich, said it right that time, and Sun Wan and Peng Yu's Can't Help Myself. Bryson's death is basically nothing. It's a teaser because we never see how it ends. Only by the movie's climax could we maybe infer that he met the same fate as Josefina, but we're still only guessing. A shot of the monkey painting after he went missing, showing him to now be a part of it, might have been nice, but I don't know, symbolism, I guess. Don Don's death is by far the laziest. I get it, it turns him into a part of the installation. The movie's supposed to cover various forms of art, from graffiti to mechanical to modern art to installations to tattoos to paintings. It's probably a means through which many artists have even gone out themselves. I get it. It's just that when compared to some of the others, it feels lackluster. Given that Don Don had this lazy, opportunistic approach to art, maybe that was the point, but I feel as though his ignorance shone through a lot more in that regard, and it just ends up falling to the wayside. It kinda sucks that paintings are such a big part of this movie, and yet the only painting death we get is Bryson's. Actually, you know what? That's the comment question for this video. If you guys had to come up with ways that a person could be killed artistically as a result of denigrating art, what would you come up with? Here's mine. 1. I'd trap someone in a statue gallery. The statues act like weeping angels, only moving when you're not looking at them, slowly creeping up on the target before they even recognize the danger. Once they do, they try to make a mad dash for freedom, but it's already too late. They're surrounded. Every time they scream, their eyes close. The statue's getting closer. They try to cover their eyes to no avail. The statues grab at their body and start pulling and twisting and contorting in ways that no human body is capable. At some point, they realize that so long as they keep their eyes open, the statues stop moving, but by that point, the body has been cast into a mangled mockery of its original form. The next day, their corpse is finally found. The statues have all moved back to their original positions, but their body remains in its twisted, mangled position, eyes frozen open in terror. Number 2, alternatively, you could go the headless statue route. Headless statues steal your head, pretty simple concept. Number 3, a music installation that makes your brain melt out of your ears. Maybe it starts out all classical, building in with some urban jungle sounds or something. The classical music starts going off key, starts getting louder, starts getting screechy. Mix in some ominous Latin, almost like the target has directly upset the gods and is being punished. Things get progressively louder and louder, their eardrums pop, their eyes start bulging out of their skull. Maybe they don't even die from this installation. They're saved at the last moment, but they're made deaf and blind by the end so that they can never appreciate art in the same way. Number 4, I mentioned AI Bros, right? Get this. AI Bro starts prompting out a self-portrait in the style of a Deece original. Unsatisfied with the results, he starts tweaking the prompts. He's done this so many times that normally this would fix the issue, but this piece comes out worse. He tries again, worse, tries again, even worse. He starts noticing that his joints hurt, it's hard to breathe, it's getting hard to see. Eventually he tries to type and nothing happens. Looking down to see that his fingers have disappeared and melted into the stump that was once his hand, he stumbles to the mirror in terror, barely able to catch his breath or even see, only to discover that his body has molded itself into a reflection of the self-portrait he created, and as the portrait got worse, so did his reflection. He desperately tries to fix the prompts, but every time he does, each iteration is worse than the last. Eventually, he's found as a disfigured, lifeless mass of writhing flesh stuck to the keyboard, and with a perfect recreation of his original form sitting there on the computer screen. If you're aware of the portrait of Dorian Gray. Kind of that. Number 5, you want to have an artist subject to the curse? Fine, I can do that. Performance artists. They don't believe in anything they push. They have this whole public persona set in place so that they can just come up with the most extreme thing to shock the audience. They set up a performance where they sit at a table inside a glass box. Viewers on the outside and a live octopus in front of them on the inside. They're going to eat the octopus alive. Before they begin, they look at the crowd that's gathered only to see them all as sea monsters staring in at them. They're trapped in a fishbowl, a spectacle for monsters. They look down at the octopus and it turns into a tiny deformed version of themselves. They look at their own fingers and start eating them. Before the installation can be halted and security called, they choke on their own fingers and die. Number 6, you could have a tattoo artist who's covered in vines. The vines come to life and strangle them, or maybe tie them up and cause them fall onto train tracks or something, I don't know. Number 7, you have a comic artist or someone who makes high art in that style a la Lichtenstein who starts having short-term whiteouts. They start seeing words floating above people's heads. They start phasing in and out of reality, walking through the white space of the panels of life. They confess to their friend that the time they spend in the white space is getting longer and longer, and it's becoming harder to find their way out. Eventually, they just entirely disappear, never to be seen again. I just gave you just as many ways to kill a person artistically as the actual movie provided. Come on, Hollywood, fucking hire me. Make Stuart Gordon the director. We'll have a blast. Y'all know that I think art is art, provided you're not doing something illegal or harmful. And sometimes, even if you are doing something illegal because the government has unfairly outlawed specific forms of expression to quell rebellion and dissonance and you're trying to stick it to the man. So why am I reviewing and writing an essay on a movie that details that commodifying art is bad? Does the message of the movie not speak to me? Do I not feel catharsis at seeing a bunch of high art snobs be served up on a silver platter? Am I not terrified of a curse coming to my doorstep? Well, no. For one thing, I don't believe in curses, and for another, you could probably argue that the movie itself is commodified already simply by being a product of the Hollywood industry. If we follow Damratia's example, you don't need a big budget or production companies. Maybe it was a part of the process, a part of the craft, and maybe things were changed about the movie to suit the tastes of the executives behind the scenes. If I die in the next week, you know a painting did it. Oh yeah, one more comment about the marketing of this movie and how insultingly unimpressed I was. I have been very careful to edit around the deaths in this film so that should you choose to watch it, there's still something to discover there. The trailer doesn't do that. The trailer spoils 4 out of 5 deaths in this film. Do not watch it. I fucking hate when horror trailers do that. For as flawed as the film is, for as unlikable as the characters are, this film does serve as a bit of a wish fulfillment for artists, probably especially for those who have been or have had their work exploited in the past. It enacts a punishment I'm sure plenty of artists have wished upon those who have screwed them over, whether they be artists who were cheated on a contract or those who have simply had their work stolen in online spaces. I'm not saying that all artists are going to like the film. My relationship with it is certainly tumultuous, but it might be worth visiting simply
for the novelty of it. Got a client who cheated you out of a commission? Watch Velvet Buzzsaw and project them onto Gretchen. Someone dug up an embarrassing piece of artwork from when you were 12? Watch Don Don get turned into ceiling decor. A commenter left a particularly scathing, ill-tempered, and spiteful critique? I mean, Morf's right there. I'll admit, finally getting to see some of these characters go was exactly what I wanted. But in some respects, it took way too long, and the end results were underwhelming. The movie feels like it lacks direction in some places, like it's not sure where it wants to go. So by the time we get to our first kill and you realize that this is the direction the film wanted to take, it makes you question what the point was in dragging its feet to get there. The sad thing is, this might have been fixed by simply moving a few scenes around and maybe shortening a couple of others. All in all, a very hit or miss film. As I said before, I could see this movie striking a chord with artists who have been subjected to excessive, damaging criticism, or perhaps those who feel as though their works are unappreciated or denigrated for what they are. I literally just got done watching a video about a body pillow company that steals art. Maybe some of the artistic victims of that might enjoy it. The movie certainly serves a purpose, but it does so with a very niche audience in mind, and further probably only appealing to a smaller subsection of that audience. Horror fans might like the horror elements but may not care for the high art facets, whereas someone might find the high art scene setting appealing but themselves are not a horror fan. Like, even with me being a part of that extra niche group, as an artist who is specifically a fan of horror content, my praises can only go so far. There are pacing issues, there are narrative issues, the whole film feels like it was written as the result of a grudge. Maybe check it out if the themes I've talked about in this video seem appealing. Give it a try if you want to experience the type of work an artist might produce in response to being bogged down by the capitalist artistic movie complex. Maybe if you specifically like the actors involved. But otherwise, you could probably give it a pass and not miss out on too much. What else? Remember, if I inexplicably die in the next week, you'll know a painting did it. Or maybe the animal corpses in my backyard will come to life and strangle me in my sleep. I don't know. Oh! That's another way to kill someone with art. Kill them with vulture culture. You could have this whole Army of Darkness stop motion kill sequence. It'd be great. Maybe have the victim use tiny animal skeletons and stop motion features and then pull them directly into the movie scene. There you go, Hollywood. I came up with an 8th one. If I see a Velvet Buzzsaw 2 and any of these are in there, I'm suing. What about you guys? Have you seen Velvet Buzzsaw before? Do you want to see it now? What means of killing people with artwork can you come up with? Leave a comment down below. Maybe you'll serve as a veritable Vetril Dees and inspire other artists. In the meantime, we'd better get to appreciating some of these gorgeous pieces of artwork, lest they manifest through the computer screens and bite our heads off. Don't look away, it's a fan art feature! And since we just got done going over a movie about critics, why don't we appreciate these pieces like the proper art snobs that we are? Cue the sterile monochrome background. We'll open this session up to a piece that is a part of the larger fan art series by the neurodivergent artist Void Feathers, which were color-coded based on the subject depicted. A smattering of flowers across the subject hints at a deeper, more complex problem throughout the entire body, including the limb that would allow them to create. This piece plays with the display of Ornithoptera priamus butterflies and blue cornflowers, the former as a means of drawing our attention to the beauty to be found in chronic pain conditions, and the latter simply because the artist likes butterflies. Which vibes. The low angle of the subject potentially plays both to the idle nature of this being fan art, but also as a means of simulating the figure laying down, almost as if the pain has become too unbearable to continue, and yet they still smile on. Some of you may assume that I'm talking out of my rear with this, but I assure you, the artist spelled it out for me in their submission email. It's like they knew that I was working on a video where that kind of extra context would be really helpful. Thanks for that. Moving on, we find ourselves in the presence of a piece by Moving on, we find ourselves in the presence of a piece by Fushiyu Ningiyo, an artist I do recognize the name of. Haunted by the quality of their previous work, this artist conveyed this digital painting with an overtly blocky stylistic approach. The vibrant greens contrasted against the purple background, all awash in an orange and yellow glow, almost like a candid photo taken at sunset. The warmer clothing serves as an appropriate choice as the days grow ever colder around us, and this is uniquely paired with the symbolic warmth offered by the presence of a number of comforting
comforting dolls in the shape of Stem, Pondersprocket, and Fiend. From Octomamas to conspiratorial cephalopods to flower babies, this piece certainly evokes the approach of the cold and the ease into personal time at the end of a long day. This next piece by the artist Sanctum may serve as a bit of a controversial one. While you may be like me and at first incorrectly assume that this is some partial reference to Herbert West Reanimator, the piece is actually evoking the saying of the main character from the Postal games, "I regret nothing." Has the subject just buried a body, or perhaps beaten someone's head in with the broad end of a shovel? Evidently, that is for you to decide. Perhaps the scratchy, ominous look of the text could shed a little extra light on what it could be. Despite the vibrant to muted greens in the background matching the figure, Sanctum differentiates them by forcing the foreground to jut off of the page as if it were coming out to get you. Better watch your back. Reaching out to us for the sake of creativity, but with no active socials to speak of at the moment, we have this piece by Hands of Time, who has opted to lean heavily into the tentacle elf aesthetic. What could they possibly be doing with those tentacles reaching just off screen? Can you read the expression present well enough to wager a guess? Do you take the blushing and the heart earrings as enough of an indicator? Or could the hidden face allude to more nefarious intentions? Hands of Time uses a simple means to convey the heavy implications of mystery. As a breath of blue air, the artist Sarukin, whilst not having many socials to share, graces us with a psychedelic warp piece of Pondersprocket, testing out their fashion-forward design skills with a unique take on the classic outfit, turning Fiend into more of a functional sash aesthetic across the dress, now equipped with some hanging sleeves, perfectly matching in length, leaning into more of a youthful, longer-haired look as well. For a psychedelic trip, this new outfit concept is nothing if not appropriate. Coming to us from a sadly now deactivated Instagram account, Poppy Lawn Leon has taken to using Stem as their muse for this piece, giving them a cheeky little expression to match the dynamic but smooth stance they've been posted in, the faded background only hinting at a vibrancy that is now dominated by the figure in the foreground, which sports a simplistic but well-defined cartoon makeup and subtle but equally defined shading. Using the light source to draw us further into that sly smile, this piece provides a playful, potentially chaotic air, reminding you to keep on your toes because the ground, much like the background, may not be so stable. As a perfect autumnal feast for the eyes, we switch on over to Pumpkin Time by Rose Teal, a spooky season-inspired fan piece featuring Pondersprocket and Fiend preparing themselves for Halloween. Of course, Fiend being such a talented artist himself, Rose Teal has him come to the rescue, designing the face that the two of them will be carving, while his lovely Ponder handles the practical side of the collaboration. The foggy background lies in wait while the two of them work on the vibrant orange pumpkin drawing our attention. Truly, Teal has captured a perfect night for carving pumpkins. For an Inception-induced glimpse into the artistic process, we'll veer over to Little Gremlin B by MissMurcurielle, where we are not only privy to the work of MissMurcurielle themselves, but also the work of their subject. As the artist appreciates not only the form and the craft, but the works of one another, the community thrives, serving as mutual muse and inspiration, as MissMurcurielle's piece will undoubtedly act as such to another. Their rich but practical and organized greens create a delicate balance that blends the nature of artist and creation to perfection. After a nibble, it's time to move on to a larger bite with this Hotdog piece by Chicolilt on Twitter, which pushes the boundaries of expression and the limitations of the humanoid mouth. Is this merely a piece of a character eating, or could it represent the ability to talk your ear off through a seemingly ever-expanding maw? The complex patterning may allude to something deeper going on beneath an angular, cartoony facade. Our attention is drawn to the big hot dog, but is that merely a means of obscuring the lurking green danger, already drooling with feral-minded intent? As a reprieve from single illustrations, we now have the dual piece Weeb Tears, Part 1 and 2 by CryptidMothie, featuring their own character indulging in the titular product only for my own to ask them to share. The split between the illustrations opens us up to the idea that the true means through which to connect to another person is by sharing a healthy dose of Weeb Tears with them, where even the character clad in white can connect to those with more sketch lines, for as we share in art, as we share in our sketches, so too do we share in the tears of the weeb. Veering away from the purple and into some more earthy tones, we have this piece by Minthe of Tall Tales Studios on YouTube. Yet another artist flexing their design skills as they come up with a cool new outfit concept, this time for my persona. An equally expressive and dynamic pose to match the expression and the fit is appropriately highlighted through a simplistic background that focuses our attention to the most important places. Paired with adorable little details such as the "Let's do this" speech bubble, the Fiend keychain, keychain, and the loving logo recreation, Minthe's design is as one might expect to see of a character in a fighting game or a fantasy-laden cartoon. A vibrant and glowing endorsement for such a fun, stylistic approach. And for the night, we'll end off with the piece Mushroom Boyo by CrimFlower, pushing the flower child into their natural extreme in a garden environment fit for frolicking fairies. We watch as Stem hides from the rain with a contented smile on their face, for why would a walking flower dislike the rain? The vibrant, shining beacon that they are, drawing our attention in as they're notably shielded by a much larger violet figure. Purposeful artistic symbolism or color-coordinated coincidence? Who can say? All one can be sure of is the light smile present on their own faces when looking at this piece. Of course, if you like any of these pieces, please don't hesitate to share some love with the artist through the links that I've provided for you down in the description. My links are also down there if you are so inclined. And with that, I don't know, you're artists, go draw something.